18 earthquakes hit one California town in a single hour last night, and not one of them was the main shock, because there wasn't one. That is the signature of a swarm, and this one broke out at the worst possible address, the doorstep of the southern San Andreas, the fault that has been silent for more than 300 years. Most swarms here fade to nothing. This same ground did it in May, too, and I'll show you exactly what scientists are watching to know which way this one goes. It started just after midnight yesterday, beneath a farming town most of the country has never heard of. At 14 minutes past midnight, Pacific time, the ground under Brawley, California, cracked with a magnitude 3.1 earthquake, 7 kilometers south of the city, at a depth of about 10.5 kilometers. That alone would not make news. Small earthquakes happen in Southern California every single day. But 17 minutes later, at 31 minutes past midnight, a magnitude 3.6 struck almost exactly the same spot, a little over 11 kilometers down, then a magnitude 3.4 at 10 to 2 in the morning, and they kept coming. By the time the sun came up, monitoring stations had logged somewhere between 17 and 18 earthquakes in roughly the first hour alone, most of them between magnitude 1.6 and 2.8, several of them above magnitude 3. Here is what makes that pattern different from an ordinary earthquake. There was no single big shock followed by smaller aftershocks. There was no main shock at all. Instead, a whole cluster of events, all near the same size, arriving in an irregular, stuttering rhythm, none of them clearly the boss. That specific behavior has a name. Seismologists call it a swarm, and swarms do not follow the normal rules. About 36 people around Brawley, Holtville, and Heber felt the magnitude 3.6 and filed reports with the United States Geological Survey. No damage, no injuries. On its own, a night like this is a nuisance, not a disaster. The reason this cluster of modest earthquakes is worth 20 minutes of your attention has almost nothing to do with the earthquakes themselves. It has to do with where they happened, because this particular patch of ground sits at the doorstep of the most dangerous quiet fault in America, a stretch of the San Andreas that has not moved in a large earthquake in more than 300 years. And every time this doorstep starts trembling, the people who study these faults for a living stop what they are doing and look north. So let's talk about what actually happened last night, what it means, and the specific things scientists are watching for right now to tell them whether this is nothing or the start of something much bigger. The place this is happening is called the Brawley Seismic Zone, and it is one of the busiest patches of crust in California. To understand why last night matters, you first have to understand why a swarm is not the same thing as a normal earthquake sequence. When most people picture an earthquake, they picture one big jolt followed by a string of weaker aftershocks that fade over hours and days. That is the standard script, and it comes from a single fault surface breaking and then settling. A swarm does not work that way. In a swarm, you get dozens or hundreds of earthquakes, clustered tightly in space, none of them dominating the others, switching on and off in bursts that can last days or weeks. The magnitude 3.6 that led last night's sequence was not a main shock. It was just the biggest so far. What drives a swarm is different too. A normal main shock is a stress problem. The crust builds up strain until a fault snaps. A swarm is usually a fluid problem. Water and sometimes magma, migrating through cracks in the rock, changing the pressure on small faults and letting them slip a little at a time. That is why swarms ignore the usual statistics. They do not decay politely like aftershocks. They can stall completely and then restart without warning, because the thing pushing them is not a single broken fault relaxing. It is fluid moving through a fractured system, and fluid can stop and start. That distinction matters for one very practical reason. In a normal sequence, once you have had the big one, the worst is statistically behind you. In a swarm, you do not get that reassurance because there is no main shock to put in the rearview mirror. The largest event might already have happened last night, or it might still be coming. That uncertainty is baked into the physics, and it is exactly why a cluster of magnitude 3s gets treated with more seriousness here than it would almost anywhere else. If last night felt familiar to people in Brawley, that is because it should have. This is not the first time this exact patch of ground has done this, and it is not even the first time this year. Just over 2 months ago, on the 9th and 10th of May, the same structure produced a far larger swarm. It began with a barely perceptible magnitude 1.6, about 5 miles beneath the city. It climbed through a magnitude 3.5 that afternoon, and it peaked just after midnight, on the 10th, with a magnitude 4.7 that woke people out of their beds and sent felt reports all the way to San Diego, more than 200 kilometers away. By the time it was done, the Geological Survey had cataloged more than 300 earthquakes. One resident described it to a reporter at the time by saying the quakes just kept on coming and coming and coming. and that the ground was still rumbling underneath them as they spoke. That May swarm is the key to reading last night, because it tells us what this structure is capable of. The May events happened at depths between about 2 and 15 kilometers, on a small fault, only about 6 kilometers long, running northeast to southwest, tucked just north of the tip of the Imperial Fault. And here is a detail worth holding on to. The largest events in May nucleated deepest, at 13 to 16 kilometers down. That is not a coincidence. Rock is stronger the farther down you go, which means earthquakes that start at those depths begin under higher stress and have more room to grow before they run out of fault to break. A swarm event that starts far below has more potential to become something bigger than its shallow neighbors. This same buried fault also lit up in late 2016 and early 2017. So we are now looking at the same structure reactivating 3 separate times across a decade. The winter of 2016, this past May, and now July. Swarms restarting on the same fault over months and years is documented, understood behavior. It is what this zone does. But every restart resets the clock on the one question nobody can answer in advance. Where does this particular sequence top out? The wider neighborhood has a longer rap sheet, and it tells you where the ceiling actually sits. In August of 2012, a swarm just north of last night's location produced 2 earthquakes above magnitude 5, a magnitude 5.3 and a magnitude 5.5, along with hundreds of smaller shocks, and it did minor damage in Brawley. Back in 1981, the Westmoreland earthquake reached magnitude 5.8, though that one behaved as a more conventional main shock with aftershocks rather than a pure swarm. And in 2020, another Westmoreland swarm got busy enough that the Geological Survey issued a formal forecast before the activity settled back down. Put those together, and you get the working ceiling for swarm-type sequences in this zone, somewhere around magnitude 5.5, big enough to break windows and crack plaster. Not on its own the kind of event that levels a region. To understand why anyone north of Brawley should care, you have to look at what this seismic zone is actually connected to. The Brawley seismic zone is not a random patch of active ground. It is a transfer zone, a kind of geological junction box. It is the place where the northern end of the Imperial Fault hands the plate motion off to the southern end of the San Andreas Fault, at the bottom of the Salton Sea. Think of it as the coupling between 2 of the most important faults in the state. When the Brawley zone shakes, it is shaking right at the base of the San Andreas. And the specific stretch of the San Andreas that begins here is the one that keeps seismologists up at night. This is the southernmost San Andreas, the section that runs along the northeast shore of the Salton Sea past a small community called Bombay Beach and up toward the Coachella Valley and greater Los Angeles beyond it. That section has a problem, and the problem is silence. It has not produced a major earthquake in at least 300 years. The chronology of its past ruptures, worked out from digging trenches across the fault and dating the disturbed layers, was published by Philibosian and colleagues back in 2011, and it shows a fault that, on average, tears loose roughly every 180 years. Do that arithmetic, and this section is not just due, it is well past due. So when a swarm fires off right at the connection point to that fault, the question writes itself. Could the small earthquakes at the doorstep give the sleeping giant next door the nudge it needs to finally wake up? That is the real story here, and it is a genuinely open scientific question, not a settled one in either direction. Now, the honest answer to whether a swarm can trigger the San Andreas is that the mechanism is real, but weak, and distance is everything. Earthquakes change the stress on the faults around them. A magnitude 3 or 4 does this over a range of only a few kilometers. So the concern is greatest when a swarm is happening right on top of the San Andreas terminus itself. Last night's swarm is roughly 60 kilometers south of that terminus. That is close enough to keep the question alive, and far enough that the actual stress it is adding to the San Andreas is small, much smaller than if this were happening at Bombay Beach. In documented cases around the world, a handful of swarms have gone on to precede much larger earthquakes. The overwhelming majority simply do not. They rise, they sputter, they fade. I want to be very clear about the most likely outcome because it would be irresponsible to sell you fear without the base rate. The single most probable ending to this sequence is that it behaves exactly like May did. It climbs, maybe produces something in the magnitude 4s, rattles some windows, and dies out over days to weeks without anything larger. That is the base case. That is where the smart money sits. If this video had to bet, it would bet on quiet. The numbers back that up, and they are worth knowing so you can calibrate your own alarm. Across all earthquakes worldwide, only somewhere between 5 and 10% of moderate shocks turn out, in hindsight, to have been foreshocks to something larger. And the probability that any given moderate earthquake is followed by a bigger one within 3 days sits at roughly 6% globally. The catch, and it is an important one, is that there is no way to identify a foreshock in advance. A foreshock only earns that label after the bigger earthquake shows up. Until then, it is just an earthquake, statistically indistinguishable from the thousands of others that lead to nothing. So when someone tells you last night was definitely the foreshock of the big one, they are claiming a power that no seismologist on Earth actually has. It also helps to remember what the real, proven hazard around here looks like, because it is not the swarm. The faults the Brawley zone connects to have a documented history of genuinely destructive earthquakes. The Imperial Valley produced twin magnitude 6.2 shocks an hour apart in 1915. The El Centro earthquake of 1940 reached magnitude 6.9 on the Imperial Fault. 1979 brought a magnitude 6.5 to the same valley. 1987 delivered a magnitude 6.5 at Superstition Hills. And in 2010, the El Mayor Cucapá earthquake just across the border in Mexico hit magnitude 7.2. Those are the events that actually damage buildings and hurt people. The swarm is the noisy symptom. Those faults are the real reason anyone in this valley keeps an earthquake kit in the closet. But there is a reason to keep watching anyway, and it is not hype. This zone is the one place in California where the Geological Survey has an actual operational protocol to raise the published odds of a San Andreas rupture in real time. It has a documented sealing, it has a documented habit of restarting, and it has twice made the agencies act. To understand why that matters, you have to go back to what happened here in 2016. There is a genuine mystery sitting underneath this whole story, and it is worth pausing on because it is the thing that actually should hold your attention. The noisiest patch of crust in Southern California sits directly at the foot of the quietest major fault in California. Constant hum at the doorstep. Total silence on the main fault. The Brawley zone swarms, stops, and restarts almost constantly. The southern San Andreas, a few dozen kilometers away, has done essentially nothing for 3 centuries, and the quiet one is the one that can kill people. Scientists have a leading idea for why that section has stayed silent so long, and it involves a lake that no longer exists. For thousands of years, the Salton Trough was periodically filled by an enormous body of water called Lake Cahuilla, far larger than today's Salton Sea. Research published by Hill and colleagues in 2023 found something remarkable. The last several major ruptures of the southernmost San Andreas each lined up with times when that ancient lake was full. The weight of all that water and the pressure it pushed into the ground may have been acting like a trigger, helping the fault let go on a more regular schedule. The lake has been essentially gone for centuries. The modern Salton Sea is a shrinking remnant of it, and that may be exactly why the fault's clock appears to have slowed down. Here is the unsettling part of that idea. If the lake was helping the fault release strain on time, then losing the lake did not make the fault safer. It just removed the trigger. The strain has kept accumulating this whole time. Several meters of it are now stored in that section of fault, with nothing to help it release. The silence is not peace. It is a loaded spring with a safety stuck on. The clearest precedent for how seriously to take a swarm here comes from 2016 at Bombay Beach, right at the fault terminus. That September, a swarm of about 100 earthquakes, topping out around magnitude 4.3, broke out directly at the southern tip of the San Andreas. And because it was right on top of the fault, the Geological Survey did something it almost never does. It ran the numbers in real time and publicly raised the estimated odds of a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake on the southern San Andreas over the following week, to as high as 1 in 100. For context, the normal background odds in any given week are somewhere around 1 in 6,000. That is a 100-fold jump. The California Office of Emergency Services issued a formal earthquake advisory. For a few days, the state was openly bracing, and then nothing happened. The swarm faded, the odds decayed back to background within the week, and the advisory quietly lapsed. No big earthquake followed. That is not a failure of the science. It is the science working exactly as designed. A 1 in 100 chance means 99 times out of 100 nothing happens. 2016 was one of the 99. But hold on to 2 things from that episode. First, the system is built for disclosure, not concealment. When the odds went up, the public was told, immediately and openly. The idea that scientists secretly know when the big one is coming and are hiding it runs directly into the 2016 record, where they raised the alarm in real time over a swarm smaller than some of what this zone can produce. And second, the reason the odds jumped so high in 2016 and would be lower for last night comes down to that one variable that governs everything here: distance to the terminus. Bombay Beach was right on it. Brawley is 60 kilometers away. To really understand why this zone swarms the way it does, you have to picture what is happening to the crust underneath the Imperial Valley farmland, because it is genuinely strange. This corner of California is being pulled apart. The Brawley seismic zone is the northernmost dry land tip of the Gulf of California rift system, the same tearing motion that is slowly ripping Baja California away from the mainland and opening the Gulf. Here, at the top of that rift, the crust is thin, it is hot, and it is soaked with circulating fluids moving through a maze of fractures. That plumbing is the engine of the swarms. Remember, swarms are fluid-driven rather than stress-driven, and this is a place with an enormous amount of hot fluid moving through broken rock. It is almost the perfect setup to produce exactly the kind of stuttering, restarting, no main shock sequences that this zone is famous for. The strangeness of the swarms, the irregular rhythm, the restarts, the missing big shock, is explained by the same underground machinery that makes this the one spot where a swarm can sit right at a great fault's doorstep. This is also where a real, science-backed concern enters the picture, and it deserves an honest hearing. The Salton Sea geothermal field operates in this zone, pulling hot fluid out of the ground to make electricity and injecting fluid back in. Research by Brodsky and Layoy, published in 2013, found a genuine correlation. The background rate of small earthquakes in that field tracks the net rate at which fluid is being pulled out. So human activity is measurably part of the seismic picture here. That is real. But it comes with hard limits. This zone was swarming for thousands of years before any power plant existed. Last night's swarm sits south of the main geothermal field, and nothing in that research suggests a geothermal plant could set off a magnitude 7 rupture on a fault 60 kilometers away. Induced seismicity is real. Induced megaquakes on the San Andreas are not a thing. There is one more piece of last night you need, because a lot of you are going to arrive at this story having already seen it framed a very specific, very wrong way online. On the same night as the Brawley swarm, about 3 hours later, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Texas Panhandle, near a small town called Spearman, at a shallow depth of under 6 kilometers. Within hours, posts were circulating claiming the two events happened at the same time and implying some continental scale connection, as if the whole middle of the country had lurched at once. Let's take that apart cleanly, because dismantling it honestly is more useful than ignoring it. The two earthquakes were about 3 hours apart, not simultaneous. They were roughly 1,700 kilometers apart. And the stress that one earthquake can pass to another fades away within a few kilometers for a magnitude 3 or 4, and within a few tens of kilometers for a magnitude 5. There is no physical mechanism, none, that connects a swarm in California to a moderate quake in Texas, 1,700 kilometers away. What you're looking at is coincidence arithmetic. This planet produces around 150 earthquakes of magnitude, 4.5 or greater every single week. Two unusual things landing on the same night is not a pattern. It is what randomness looks like. The Texas quake is its own separate story, and an interesting one. It sits in a region where oil and gas wastewater injection has been driving earthquakes for years, which is a genuine induced seismicity issue worth its own coverage. But it has nothing to do with Brawley. And while we are clearing the deck, the sun was quiet last night, geomagnetically calm, low numbers across the board, which retires the recurring claim that solar activity or planetary alignments are shaking the Earth. There was no space weather to blame. The driver here is local, fluid and broken rock at the top of a rift. So here is the part the title promised. The specific, concrete things scientists are watching right now to tell them whether last night was noise or the opening of something serious. This is not vague. There are 3 signals, and you can watch for them yourself. The first is magnitude. If the swarm climbs past May's peak of magnitude 4.7, and especially if it pushes toward the zone's historical swarm ceiling of around magnitude 5.5, that changes the risk picture. For scale, a magnitude 5.5 releases roughly 700 times the energy of last night's magnitude 3.6. The event's climbing, rather than fading, is the first red flag. The second signal is direction. Watch where the earthquakes move. If the activity stays put beneath Brawley, that is the reassuring case. If it starts migrating north, toward Westmoreland, toward the geothermal field, and above all toward Bombay Beach and the San Andreas terminus, that is the scenario that matters, because that is the direction that would carry the swarm from 60 kilometers away to right on top of the fault into 2016 territory. Location is everything with this hazard, and migration north is the single most important thing to track. The third signal is official. If the Geological Survey issues a formal aftershock forecast, or the state issues an earthquake advisory like the way both happened in 2016 and again during a 2020 swarm at Westmoreland, that is your cue that the professionals have run the real-time numbers and decided the odds have moved enough to say so out loud. You will not have to guess. If that threshold gets crossed, they will tell you, publicly, the same way they did before. Let's bring this back to where it started. Last night, the ground beneath Brawley started shaking again, in the same stuttering, no main shock rhythm it produced in May and in 2016 before that. The most likely outcome, by a wide margin, is that it does what it did every one of those times. It rises, it rattles, and it fades out over the coming days without producing anything larger than a moderate quake. If you live down there, the realistic thing to prepare for is a few more restless nights, not a catastrophe. But the reason this is worth watching is not the swarm. It is the fault next door. The southernmost San Andreas, silent for more than 3 centuries, loaded with several meters of stored strain, sitting 60 kilometers from a patch of ground that will not stop trembling. Science can tell you the odds that any given swarm nudges that fault awake, and those odds are low. What science cannot yet tell you is why the most heavily loaded section of the most famous fault on Earth stays perfectly still while everything around it shakes, or which swarm, if any, finally ends the silence. The 3 specific things to watch are simple: whether the earthquakes get bigger, whether they march north toward the terminus, and whether the agencies issue a formal advisory. Until one of those things happens, this stays what it most likely is: a noisy night at the doorstep. We will be tracking it closely, and if the doorstep starts moving toward the door, you will hear about it here first.